Alrighty, times where Overwatch League players flexed onto off-roles, part 2. Let's get into it. If you want another good example of like a one-off experience of a main tank player doing something that an off-tank would do, I like to think of a more unusual one in Axiom for the Boston Uprising at the beginning of 2019. As ColorHex was supposed to be their Zarya player at the start, but he was serving a 3-game suspension for boosting, so they had to rely on a different option at tank since they had no backup off-tank, so Axiom answered the call. While clearly not a top Zarya player during this time, Axiom held his own and had some pretty good moments with some high charge. Ultimately, he kept the Boston Uprising afloat with a big win over the Houston Outlaws. Without that win, they don't make the Stage 1 playoffs, and he made some notable contributions throughout. So a pat on the back is definitely deserved. While we're still talking about Zarya, I think it's necessary to go over a pretty random one that you may have forgotten about. I myself actually forgot about it until someone left a comment in the previous video, and it's Aztec playing Zarya as a flex support player for the Toronto Defiant during these random instances on Temple of Anubis. It's not something that anybody expected to see. Aztec was a solid, world-class flex support player in Overwatch Contenders Korea, and now all of a sudden, he's benched for Lastro, and the only real opportunity he gets to play is in a Zarya role. What kind of weird strat were they running over there? What was KDG cooking to have their natural off-tank player in Michelle come out of the game for Aztec? Don't really understand the logic behind this one, but in all fairness, Aztec didn't look awful on the Zarya. It made no sense, and it made you want to scratch your head. It didn't feel natural at all. But he had some high charge moments where he got some big grabs off and helped his team capture a couple of points. Man probably randomly got called up by KDG saying, hey, you should start practicing Zarya because you're pretty good at her, I guess. Pretty weird situation to have for sure, especially as a guy that only was accustomed to playing Ana and BAP in Zenyatta. To suddenly transition like this, I can't even imagine. It was only like a one-map thing, but still. Going out there and getting thrown out against the Wolves, against these pro players, when you have little to no experience on this role, that's some crazy stuff, and you've got to be on the real crackpot strategies to break out something like this. Going back towards the more dreaded GOATS era days, we have Michelle, off-tank player, picking up the Sombra for the Seoul Dynasty. Now, Sombra is something that a lot of off-tanks had to pick up during this time, but I chose to include Michelle's performance against the YOLO because it really was that historic. Coming into this matchup, nobody expected the Seoul Dynasty to advance past the clearly superior-looking YOLO team on paper, and it helped that historically, the Dynasty were currently 0-5 in the all-time series against the YOLO. But nonetheless, Michelle went in there, zero pressure whatsoever, and outputted one of the most amazing Sombra performances of all time, which led to the Dynasty getting a huge upset victory over the YOLO, and it's probably one of their greatest accomplishments and victories to this day. For a guy we're not accustomed to watching on Sombra, this was a rather clutch and intelligent performance, oftentimes making Meko's life a living nightmare by hacking him in his mech and making him utterly useless, or forcing Jonek to make terrible decisions, which is not something we see very often. And in general, he threw the YOLO off their game, and that's a big time statement to make. To confuse an YOLO team that was very much still in their prime levels of dominance is out of this world levels of crazy. It usually takes an absolute team performance to slow these guys down. You have to draw up a great game plan and be in perfect unison with your teamwork. But Michelle, as a single individual, was able to do that much on his own. It was an incredible moment in Seoul's history and easily one of the greatest off-rolling experiences we'll ever witness. Sticking with Dynasty tank players and swapping roles, we also have an interesting and somewhat controversial one in Marvel. This one has mixed levels of success. On one hand, when it came to the big moments where the Dynasty were successful in 2020, Marvel Sigma made a massive difference. However, during the other moments in between, it was an absolute nightmare watching him play things like D.Va and Zarya. That lack of experience and skill off of Sigma reared its ugly head at times and led to some quite confusing losses. and it makes you wonder why they refused to rely on Michelle and later on Tuyu when they were right there with more experience on the role. But nonetheless, at his brightest moments, Marvel was a solid off-tank contributor for the Dynasty, in both of their playoff runs in fact. In 2019, when he swapped onto that role and forced Michelle onto the Orisa, and in 2020, especially during the playoff run and the grand finals later on. But I suppose the suffering and the experience he gained ended up not being a bad thing at all, pivoting to Overwatch 2, because tank players are supposed to be more reliable and flexible now, and Marvel ultimately fits that bill. If you want another recent example when it comes to swapping to tank and everything, you got Dante. Technically, at the beginning of 2022, we didn't really know what his role was going to be. He was playing Doomfist, but there also were a couple of instances when he played the Tracer, so it seemed kind of undetermined on what his real role would be, but before we knew it, he settled into the tank role full time, and that's what he's still doing to this day, and honestly, he did a pretty good job for somebody who had no prior experience. At first, he started as just a Doomfist specialist, but it quickly turned into being the team's full-time tank player, even playing Junker Queen and Winston of all things. It shows that Dante is generally smart and good at the game if he's able to pick up this role that he had no prior experience on and hold his own and play at a very high level like this. It's a simple one, and some people might not count it, but I thought I'd reference it because it is pretty interesting to be a DPS player for like over 5 years and then make the sudden swap like this. But you know, he's not the only person to have worn a Houston Outlaws uniform that made the swap from DPS to tank, because we also got Hydration in that regard. He's done it multiple times throughout his career where he's played something else, not just tank. We'll cover all of that. The most prominent is definitely when he replaced Muma, who was pretty bad in 2020, as the Outlaws' new starting main tank, playing everything from Winston to Rhine to Orisa to Wrecking Ball. And he had a few decent moments throughout, some decent pull combos on the Orisa, a couple of good primals with the Winston, but what more so stands out at least to me are the other moments throughout his career where he flexed off of DPS. One came, well I guess two, in 2019 for the LA Gladiators. One was with this interesting control strategy where he'd swap onto the Wrecking Ball. It even gave the NYXL of all teams some issues. And then the other, more interestingly, was when he played Sigma in the 2019 playoffs against the Hangzhou Spark. Not something you'd expect him to play, considering that Void was just entering the prime of his career at the time. To play Sigma over one of the greatest off-tanks of all time is ridiculous. Hydration wasn't anything out of this world, but he held his own. It was respectable. It got the job done in that series. But my favorite moment of him flexing onto something random for the LA Gladiators with D.Pay's wacky random strategies came in Stage 2, 2018, and of Map 5 versus the Houston Outlaws, and this one is actually a collaborative effort. It's not just Hydration that makes the cut. It's also going to be Big Goose and Shaz who join him, as they were all a part of the weirdness. In a do-or-die Map 5 against the Houston Outlaws, the LA Gladiators on Ilios decided to roll out with Hydration on Lucio, Shaz on Tracer, and Big Goose on Sombra. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. You're having your main support and flex support on DPS, and your flex DPS on support. Does that not make anyone else's head want to explode? This composition made zero sense, and yet it worked. In a critical final round, the Gladiators won against the Outlaws with this composition. Hydration was able to get a couple of good beats off, Shaz found a couple of picks in the back line, and Big Goose was able to do his thing with the EMPs. But nonetheless, it was really weird to see three guys off-roll all at the same time and still find success against a team that was still pretty decent at the time. Hats off to D.Pay for this strat, and for the players for somehow executing this wild 1 in a million strategy that you'll never see ever again. Oh, and before I move on, just gotta say, Shaz also played some Genji from time to time for the Gladiators in Season 1, so that just adds on to the weirdness for him and that team and some of the stuff they were doing back then. But wait, there's one other wacky off-rolling composition that we have to cover in this video, and it belongs to the 2019 Florida Mayhem. In a YOLO strategy against a shock team they knew they couldn't beat, they attempted to catch them off guard by playing Fate on May, Hagupun on Junkrat, and Zephyr on Pharah. This was an actual thing they tried to play. No tanks or anything of the sort against a team that was insanely good at goats. and to a certain extent, it found some success. They weren't totally dominating the round, but it did lead to the Shock feeling confused and feeling the need to swap, so good on the Mayhem for doing something so random, so stupid, and so out of left field, and having it at least kind of work. I just can't get over the weirdness of it all. To have no tank, then have your main and off tank on DPS, and your flex support? Like, is this out of desperation, or are you just stupid? Or maybe a little of both. Regardless, this is a legendary composition that does not get talked about nearly enough. Speaking of not getting enough love, our boy Zephyr actually gets on for individual reasons as well. Did you know that he also played Pharah and Tracer and Bastion against the Houston Outlaws in one series? The Pharah thing is always the funniest to me, and it sticks out the most, as on the opening fight on Ilios, he soloed Jake and Boink in the skies with some pretty nasty shots. It's pretty impressive for a guy who is an absolute below average off tank that gets memed on to no end. And later on, I mean, when he played Bastion, come on now. That was a legendary performance on defense to hold the Houston Outlaws from finishing Gibraltar while you have Uber losing his mind in the background. It was all so perfect and probably one of the greatest Bastion plays in League history, and it belongs to Zephyr of all people. This is why he's my GOAT, folks. This is why he's my GOAT. Oh, and shout out to the time he randomly played Reaper, because why not? Yeah, I don't really know about this one. I don't understand the purpose of it, nor why the Mayhem thought it was a good idea, but hey, that's another thing that Zephyr played to make him more legendary. Switching back over to a more serious manner, I wanted to go over Badoshin of the London Spitfire, another guy who did some OG flexing back in the day in 2018 and made a pretty major difference for his team during the playoffs and ultimately the grand finals. During this meta, flex supports truly had to live up to their names by playing a lot of Roadhog for that triple tank composition, as well as some DPS from time to time, and Badoshin did it masterfully. Badoshin's Roadhog actually made quite the difference for the Spitfire in their playoff run. He had a lot of good moments with Gesture, their synergy was on point, he had some good individual pop-offs on the side, and what's great is that it extends beyond the Roadhog. He was clutch for that reason a lot, of course, but he even played some Tracer from time to time, and it did some decent damage. There was one moment in particular against the LA Valiant where he went for the back line and really made them suffer. For a guy we're accustomed to seeing on Zenyatta and Ana and whatnot, this was a nice performance. Speaking of 2018 playoff flexes, we couldn't possibly go this entire video without talking about Hoppa, who has made a career for himself through a bunch of flexing that he did early on in his first 2 years in the league. In 2018, he was essentially Mirror before Mirror was a thing. He played support, tank, and DPS in the Fusion playoff run. He played a lot of D.Va and Roadhog for the tank scenarios, but for the moments where the Fusion would play triple tank, Hoppa would have to play some support since Boombox wasn't in the game. So as cursed as it was, we saw Hoppa play Moira and Zen. Not something you'd expect from a guy who's used to diving Zens, but nonetheless, he did what he could. It was a little awkward to watch, but the man tried his best. And finally, on the DPS end, he played some Tracer, specifically to cause some chaos in the backline, draw their attention, maybe get a kill or two. He did have a couple of decent pop-offs, especially against the Boston Uprising. There was this one moment where he was able to pick off Striker and get another big kill in the clutch. He did some good things on that Tracer role when we weren't expecting much of anything at all for a guy who mostly didn't play all season in favor of Poko. Then, just 1 year later, on the Guangzhou Charge, Hoppa continued his reign of terror as a flex god by playing a ton of DPS, especially in the early parts of that year. Playing things from Sombra, to Tracer, to Pharah. He did everything. The Tracer in particular looked pretty darn good, to the point where the Charge religiously nano-boosted him, and he'd put in the work, man. He got some good picks and caused some chaos with those triple DPS comps the Charge like to run. So good on him for making a difference on a role that he's not exactly known for. There was a lot put on Hoppa's shoulders back then, and he did it all without hesitation. Need him to play Sombra against the best GOATS teams in the league? He's got you. Need him to play Pharah? He'll do it. He'll get you a couple of kills. No matter what was asked of this guy, he performed, and he doesn't get nearly enough credit for it. Now for some more one-off instances. The first of which that comes to mind is Fury, who on the London Spitfire played a variety of DPS characters from 2018 to 2019. In 2018, he randomly broke out the Soldier 76 on Oasis against the LA Valiant, and the Spitfire proceeded to absolutely roll them on that round. Now, he didn't contribute much, but he still played it. The more significant and interesting thing where he did make an impact would be on the Hanzo and Pharah, particularly against the YOLO. There were multiple instances in that game where he'd break out these characters instead of playing the D.Va and would make a real difference with some big pop-offs with the barrage, hitting some headshots with the Hanzo, even getting nanoed in the clutch. He did so much for this team on the heroes that you wouldn't expect him to play. My guy Fury did some crazy things back then. To swap onto DPS, no problem, instead of playing his iconic and famous D.Va, it still doesn't make any sense to me. What's with it with tank players and playing Pharah? You have Bumper, Fury, all these guys. Heck, even Spree did it one time. You know, that guy that was supposed to be a Zarya specialist only for the Outlaws, the guy who changed King's Row's name to Spree's Row, the guy that came into Lijiang Tower to specifically play Zarya on Control Center. Yeah, that guy broke out the Pharah, and it worked. This is like such a weird and unmemorable thing that happened, but for some reason it sticks out in my mind. I remember Spree always being that great Zarya guy, and seeing him play Pharah in a big game, it just didn't click in my head, so I definitely wanted to share it. Want something else that feels random? How about when Boombox played Torbjorn against the Shanghai Dragons in 2018 on Watchpoint Gibraltar defense? Yeah. They did this. That's how disrespectful they were feeling towards the Dragons at the time. And keep in mind, this is pre-changes. This is OG Torbjorn with the level 3 turret. This is when Torb was even worse than he is right now. Nobody wanted to use him. He wasn't viable in the slightest. But here comes Boombox breaking it out in one of the only instances that we saw that year. It is wildly disrespectful to do such a thing, and the fact that they almost full held the Dragons is pretty crazy. Want something else that feels weird? How about that time that Shaxx played D.Va against the Hangzhou Spark in a Stage 3 playoff game in a Map 5? Admittedly, he played it a couple of other times throughout that series, but this was the most important time. In a do-or-die Map 5 on a potential round-clinching game. If they won this round, they were going to win the series and advance to the next round. Shaxx broke out the D.Va full-time and even ate Godspeed's Graph to help set up a victory for the Valiant. That's some crazy stuff for a guy who had no prior experience on D.Va whatsoever. The only tank play he really did was Zarya for Goats back during Mayhem Academy. Shaxx was signed to this team exclusively to play DPS and to be Sombra during the Sombra Goats era. So coming out there, doing that on D.Va, when you had no experience and you're in a situation where you could be sent home in the first round, and to do that? My hat goes off to you, sir. Want something else that's stupid? What about when the Atlanta Reign thought it was a bright idea to play Winston Reinhardt Goats against the Boston Uprising? I remember that. Fried Wiener going out there as an off-tank player, playing Monkey, doing his thing, and actually helping the Atlanta Reign win that round? It made no sense to me whatsoever. Everyone played D.Va back then. You needed a D.Va, and if you weren't playing D.Va, you were playing Sombra. But here come Atlanta, playing a Winston and a Ryan at the same time, a double main tank Goats composition. It's not a flashy or out-of-the-ordinary pick, but it felt weird from a compositional standpoint, and it felt wrong to see FRD and Winston in the same frame. Want more weirdness? I got you. How about the time that Elk in Season 2 for the Philly Fusion picked up Zenyatta? At the time, he was a promising two-way prospect out of Fusion University, mostly expected to just play the Lucio, but when Boombox got sick, he had to answer the call since there was no other flex support on the roster. So he broke out the Zen against the Florida Mayhem and, well, didn't go too well. And the Florida Mayhem even won that game, that being their only win of the stage. So not the greatest look in the world. But to make up for it in a kind of fun manner, he also played some Tracer during that series and had a couple of nice pop-offs to keep the Fusion in the game on Temple of Anubis. So there's that for you. A bit of a redeeming quality. It doesn't really change the outcome of the game, of course, but it was fun to see an off-tank player yet again do some crazy things on Tracer. Another more recent thing that happened when it comes to DPS swapping over to tank, you've got Dia, who took over the full-time Junker Queen duties during the Summer Showdown for the LA Valiant. As a guy who was always known for DPS beforehand, This was a bizarre choice, but nonetheless, he held his own somewhat frequently, made some good plays when it mattered, and while the Valiant didn't win all that much during that stage, he certainly helped them from not being blown out as much as they could have. We all saw it, it's still kind of firmly locked in our memories, so that's all I really have to say. It was fun to watch him on the Queen, and we'll leave it at that. We have all these examples of tank players doing weird things for their teams and having mixed results, but one guy that I firmly believe had decent results on a consistent basis was Elsa. 2019 and 2020 saw him do a lot for this Chengdu team, and it makes you wonder where they would have been without him, and this was before he arguably hit his peak just one season later. See, in 2019, Chengdu liked to engage in some tomfoolery, if you will. We all know that. They would play the DPS and the Wrecking Ball compositions, but what you may not remember is sometimes they'd have Elsa break out the DPS with great success. Some of the typical examples you'd probably think of would be to the same extent of like Michelle or Hoppa. Elsa was able to do some good things on the Tracer from time to time, find some opening picks, and his Sombra even caused the San Francisco Shock some nightmares in what ended up being one of their only losses of the year. What I tend to think of more though, and really love, is when things started to get weird. When the Chengdu Hunters would break out a Symmetra on attack against the Paris Eternal, for example. Elsa absolutely crushed it. The TPs were on point, and he was beaming people down left and right. He wasn't just there for teleporter purposes. He was absolutely fragging. They could not kill this man, and he obliterated Paris on multiple attack attempts. To this day, I still don't quite understand how Paris let him get away with that much, but nonetheless, it was probably one of the best sim plays in League history, so good on Elsa for making that happen. And also good on him for playing freaking Torbjorn. In 2019, before he was super popular, during the GOATS era, he was typically bringing this out on defense sometimes. This wasn't just a 1 or 2 off thing. There's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 different instances where he played Torb on defense for Chengdu that year. And in a couple of those instances, it gave some teams real issues, especially the Atlanta Reign. That one's firmly locked into my memory. Horizon Lunar Colony, him bopping everybody in sight, the turret going off. Elsa was a freaking god, man. And that wraps up part 2 of times where OWL players off-rolled. It's crazy to think that there's so many different examples of it happening. It feels so unnatural, and yet it was a somewhat frequent occurrence throughout the first 5 years of the league, and I can't help but wonder if we're going to see more in Season 6. If you enjoyed this kind of video and you want more just like it, be sure to give this video a big fat thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you're new, and let me know what your favorite moment was down in the comments below. Oh, and if it's your first time seeing this series and a video of mine, make sure to check out part 1, which I'll leave a link to in the end card. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.